2 words, Revo Fitness. Here's a few more. Simple, 24/7, reformer Pilates, body scanners, massage chairs, squat racks, free weights, pin and plate loaded equipment, no lock-in contracts, no bullshit. All of that and more from just $9.69 a week. That's surprisingly affordable. Join now at Revo Fitness Blair Athol or download the Revo Fitness app. RevoFitness.com.au or find the Revo Fitness app in the App Store.
Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Nearly 3 weeks since Donald Trump's Liberation Day tariffs and 2 weeks since many of those tariffs were paused, the initial shock might have worn off, with markets gradually adjusting to the reshaping of global trade. But big challenges remain, obviously, including the negotiation of either reduced tariffs with the US or new trade deals between other countries, which might present an opportunity for places like Australia. Tom Kenny is a senior international economist at ANZ. Tom, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Hi, Sean. Thanks for having me.
Have you ever lived through a 3 weeks like the last 3 weeks, at least in your professional life?
No, it doesn't feel like it. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I mean, I kind of liken it to the initial days of COVID and the GFC. Yeah, it's pretty frenetic.
So where do we stand at the moment? Is uncertainty still the overwhelming kind of feeling, and therefore we have to wait and see? Or do we have a little bit more kind of knowledge of where we're going?
No, I think the uncertainty is still very elevated. Look, Trump's just been backwards and forwards on his tariff announcements, excluding some items, including other items, changing tact on his, on his tariffs. I think the issue is he issued these tariffs using the executive orders on national security grounds. So it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly why, he's putting down some of these tariffs in some instances. And the whole reciprocity of the tariffs, I think, was very confusing to a lot of nations. We were promised, a fairly detailed costing of, for US exporters, the costing of doing business in foreign countries. And in the end, it just turns out that it's a simple, if the larger the surplus you run with the US, the bigger the tariff. And I think that, therein lies the difficulty for countries going to sort of negotiate with the US on how they're supposed to sort of lower those tariffs, because it's difficult to know how you've put the tariff at that particular level.
Yep. I want to this morning talk to you about sort of the drivers of global growth. And we might not talk about China, but of the Western economy. So that's US, Europe and Japan. What's the prognosis for the US at the moment?
Well, the US was entering this year with fairly good momentum. US household balance sheets are pretty solid. We'd had a build-up in financial wealth considerably since COVID, actually. Very little movement in leverage, but quite a good deal of increase in financial asset worth, good increase in household values as well. So household balance sheets were looking pretty solid. They were dealing with inflation, higher prices, which they didn't like. But the consumer was certainly spending and driving a lot of the US growth, above trend growth over the course of 2024. And so, I mean, our prognosis going forward, I guess, is that, the sentiment's a bit shaky. There's not really a strong relationship between sentiment and spending, but I think the longer sentiment stays depressed or down, then the more likelihood that's going to be reflected in spending habits going forward. And just, I think this overwhelming uncertainty about where policy stands is very difficult or challenging for both households and businesses, knowing what they're going to, how do they go about planning something if they're not sure what the policy on what Trump's policies are going to be doing.
So what's the likelihood of the US slowing down potentially even for a recession?
Well, look, we just recently revised our growth forecast for the US. So we had previously been thinking around about 2% for 25. We've scaled that back to 1.5%. So that's virtually almost like a stalling in growth for the rest of this year. So very sharp slowing in consumer spending and business spending. Look, we potentially put the odds of recession in the US at the moment at 40%. That could go high. That's based on the current tariff regime at the moment. But if we get all these reciprocal tariffs coming back in the next, 60 days it is, then that probably raises the odds of a US recession.
Tom, just give us a sense of why the US matters so much to economies like Australia and the global economy generally.
Well, it's the single largest importer in the world. So if you're trying to look for an alternative market in diversifying, it's slim pickings and trying to find another market. So the US is very important for global trade, being the largest importer. So if demand there drops off, it's going to be quite a shock to the global economy.
Stay with me, Tom. We'll be back in a minute.
2 words, Revo Fitness. Here's a few more. Simple, 24/7, reformer Pilates, body scanners, massage chairs, squat racks, free weights, pin and plate loaded equipment, no lock-in contracts, no bullshit. All of that and more from just $9.69 a week. That's surprisingly affordable. Join now at Revo Fitness Blair Athol or download the Revo Fitness app. RevoFitness.com.au or find the Revo Fitness app in the App Store.
I'm speaking to Tom Kenny from ANZ. We spoke about the US and we always talk about the US, but let's talk about the other big Western powerhouses at least. Starting with Europe, we've heard that Australia has started again free trade negotiations with that economy. I mean, what's the prospect for Europe given the tariffs? And then how will that play out for economies like Australia?
Yeah, well, I guess with the free trade agreement, that is, I think, an interesting or exciting opportunity for Australia going forward. At present, Europe imposes a number of tariffs on like minerals and metals, and it also has some quotas on agriculture goods. So if we move towards a free trade agreement, those kind of barriers to doing trade will come down. And I think overall that would be, what we've seen in the past with free trade agreements is that you do see an increase in trade relations and investment flows between those two countries. So that would be our expectation of, moving towards a free trade agreement there.
What about Europe as an economy? It seems to have been a bit of a laggard for a long time. What are its prospects?
Well, at the moment, things are a little bit down. The economy is slowing or has been pretty weak for a while now. But interest rates coming down. We're expecting further cuts there. And it looks as though across the region, there'll be a bit of increased fiscal spending there to support the economy. So prospects are improving.
How important is it for the EU to negotiate a decent deal with the US?
Look, I think that's pretty important. But I think it's a broader relationship game than just the two countries. It's based on national security issues as well. There's with NATO, there's issues there. And there's also issues with, it looks as though the US is trying to drive a decoupling agenda with China. So there'll be a lot of, negotiations around how much, Europe should or shouldn't be trading with China. So looking at the US, Europe, it's broader than that, I think, for the two economies.
Just delve into that, because really only the last 2 or 3 days have we heard much about this whole kind of third-party issue which Trump is trying to push Europe, for example, in this instance, to not trade as much with China, and he'll say he'll penalise people who are doing trade deals with China. How much of a worry is that?
I think that's extremely worrying, and that's the big element of unknown, I think, because he's done it in the past with, people that, have dealt with Venezuela. He's punished people there. If it's China, well, obviously China's tentacles spread a lot further than Venezuela. So I think that, that would be pretty dire if the US, wants to direct who other nations can trade with.
Yeah. What about Japan, big trading partner of ours in Australia? Japan's economy looks like it was springing to life. Springing might be overstating it, Tom. But it was sort of coming to life at least. What about now? Is that still the case, or are these tariffs likely to stop it?
Oh, look, I think tariffs there are a big concern for Japan. They obviously have a heavy exposure to the US market, particularly with motor vehicles. Trade features quite strongly in its overall GDP. So, the prospects for Japan, I think, going forward will be could potentially be damaged if they don't sort of negotiate a much lower tariff rate with the US. In terms of opportunities for Australia, I guess, our largest import from Japan would be motor vehicles. They account for roughly about 2/3 of our imports. Potentially, we might get to see cheaper, motor vehicles in Australia, but I'd be more concerned about what's happening with global demand than worrying about a cheaper car.
Well, just had a two-way trade relationship with Japan. We import a lot of vehicles. Are we still selling basically commodities, coal and things like that to Japan? Is that?
Yeah, minerals and ore make up the bulk of our exports to Japan, and really that's largely dependent on our endowments of those particular items, and Japan's need for those.
Once the 90 days is up, and we're a couple of weeks into that 90 days, that's the 90-day pause on tariffs. What would you like to see, Tom? Rather than, it's a crystal ball, I get that, but what would you like to see?
Well, I'd like to see some good faith coming from the US administration in terms of trying to negotiate those tariffs down. If that doesn't happen, then I'm quite concerned about what will happen to financial markets. We did see a couple weeks back that pretty much all across the board, all US assets were being sold as investors lost confidence in the US economy. And I think if that were to be the case, it would be pretty, risky, dark outlook if that were to be the case going forward.
Let's hope not. Tom, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
No worries. Thanks very much, Sean.
That was Tom Kenny, Senior International Economist at ANZ. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.
Two words, Revo Fitness. Here's a few more. Simple, 24/7, reformer Pilates, body scanners, massage chairs, squat racks, free weights, pin and plate loaded equipment, no lock-in contracts, no bullshit. All of that and more from just $9.69 a week. That's surprisingly affordable. Join now at Revo Fitness Windsor Gardens or download the Revo Fitness app, revofitness.com.au, or find the Revo Fitness app in the App Store.